Hey everyone, Matt from Stronger Personal Training here, and today we're talking about programming light and medium days. So with the rest of the series so far, we've mainly discussed programming your higher intensity days or your days where you're pushing for progress, but we haven't really talked about the rest of the training week. So we'll make a few assumptions here just for ease of example, but again, you can apply these concepts to any training situation. So a little bit of preface here, we find most lifters who are past the beginner phase where you can kind of do anything and get stronger, need to train a lift generally more than once a week, generally in that 2 to 4 times a week, depending on how strong they are, who they are as a lifter, being age, gender, body weight, and absolute strength levels, as we talked about a second ago. So that'll determine the frequency. For today's purposes, we're going to be really talking about a lifter who's training heavy twice a week. So these are generally going to be your intermediate strength males who are average body weight, average height. You get the idea. Sort of your most common lifter. Same could be applied for sort of medium body weight females that are maybe a little bit stronger than that. So let's get into it. So we're making the assumption that we're training twice a week for the lift, and we found that for this lifter, it works really well. We're going to be using our +4-2 model of training progression that we've talked about in previous videos. We're going to assume that it's 4 weeks to PR for this lifter, so we know that it takes them 4 weeks to really build up to that next PR in their training blocks. And then we're also going to be assuming a 5% weekly progression. So a little bit of a faster, more aggressive progression model, but still falls within that 2.5 to 5% range that we've talked about. Relating this to what we've talked about before. So if we have our +4-2 progression, we would end up with this lifter who's training triples, starting out with 100 kilos on bench press, let's say. They're going 100 kilos on week 1, 105 kilos on week 2, 110 kilos on week 3, 115 on week 4, right? And then they'd back cycle 2 weeks and start again at 105 kilos on week 1 on their second block and go 105, 110, 115, 120. And then there's their 5 kilo PR, right? So now that we've got all that out of the way, let's talk about building in light and medium days. So who should use this in the first place? If you're a lifter who's finding that you're not really able to just push big PRs twice a week, maybe this is for you and you need to start programming a little bit more recovery and managing fatigue a little bit better as you get stronger in your training. So generally speaking, we'll start lifters out with about a 90% day, which I would qualify as more of a medium training day. And that 90% isn't a 90% of 1 rep max, it's a 90% of their higher intensity training day. So if they trained at 100 kilos on the Monday, week 1, they're going to go 90 kilos, and then 95 on week 2, 100 kilos on week 3, and 105 kilos on week 4. And what we're doing here is we're affording the lifter to have a little bit of active recovery. That second day probably isn't going to feel too great because you're strong enough to beat yourself up from training now, where that 100 kilo PR, or more specifically this 115 kilo PR on your week 4, is probably going to take it out of you a little bit. So you need a little bit of a lighter day where you're okay coming in a little bit more fatigued and you don't have to be performing at 100%, but training the movement again helps keep the ball rolling. So to where you're not detraining over the course of the week after you've recovered from the workout, but it actually helps to promote a little bit more recovery and again, keep the progression happening. And a lot of lifters who go from once a week training, let's say, for example, they were only training squats on Mondays or bench on Mondays or whatever lift they're training, adding in this second day, even though it's not a PR day per se, they'll make better progress because they've got a higher frequency of the lift and they're managing fatigue a little bit better without allowing themselves to detrain and missing that SRA curve, right? So as you start to progress, as you start to get a little stronger again, you will beat yourself up a little bit more, and those heavier Monday bench workouts are going to take it out of you. So what do? Well, we make your light days lighter. So we've worked at a 90% intensity range so far of your heavy day, and most of these like heavy triples, let's say, are going to fall in that 85 to 95% range, roughly speaking, of your 1 rep max. Maybe it's 80 to 98. It really depends on the lifter, but we're going to say for easy math, 85 to 95%, which means for our lighter days at 90%, we're probably falling somewhere between about 77 and 86%, roughly speaking, of 1 rep max for the lighter days. So getting into even lighter, right? This lifter who's finding that, oh, they're getting through and they're getting stronger, and maybe they're bench pressing 130 kilos now, for example. We're not going to change the numbers, but just as a situational example here. So they've progressed, they've gotten stronger. These 90% days aren't cutting it anymore. They're still kind of showing up fatigued, and it's taking a little bit too much out of them just because they're stronger now. And that absolute level of strength it takes its toll. So maybe we go down to an 80 or even a 75% day of that. So again, assuming we're working in that kind of 85 to 96%, 95% kind of range of 1 rep max, if we're going down to 75%, we're looking around 67 to 73%, somewhere in that range, right? So you can see that's considerably lighter than sitting at 75 to 84, give or take, right? So we'll program this in, and if we're at 75%, here we go, 75, 80, 85, and 90. And you can see how those jumps, that drop in intensity on the Thursday bench workout is considerably larger, which is going to afford for more recovery because it's less fatiguing to do that workout. And that's all we're really trying to get at here, is having an extra day where you're not necessarily worried about pushing and going for another PR because you're too strong to go for 2 PRs a week at this point, and building a little bit more recovery into your program so you can really capitalize on the momentum that you build on your day 1, or in this lifter's case, their Monday bench press workout. If you have any questions about this or questions you want answered about your training, whether it be technique, programming, or any of the likes, feel free to shoot me a DM or mention it in the comments below. Thanks. I'll talk to you next time.